1971, 6 states: Abu Dhabi, Ajman, Fujairah, Sharjah, Dubai, Al Quwain, merged to form the United Arab Emirates. They were joined in 1972 by Ras Al Khaimah. Located in the Middle East between Oman and Saudi Arabia, it has a total land area of 83,600 square kilometers. The UAE's natural resources are petroleum and natural gas. The UAE's per capita GDP, or gross domestic product, is on par with those of leading West European nations. Its high oil revenues and its moderate foreign policy stance have allowed the UAE to play a vital role in the affairs of the region. The UAE has gone through a change of rapid globalization in the past few decades. This is evident through the many cultural, economic, and environmental changes the UAE has witnessed. Dubai, in particular, is well known throughout the world, and globalization has changed the life of the Emirati forever. One specific way of examining globalization is through the role education plays within a society. 90% of the total population is literate, and many international educational facilities exist in the UAE, including the American University and the Australian International School, both located in Sharjah. Schools like these allow students to study many foreign ideas, and students are able to explore and immerse themselves in foreign educational practices. Let's take a look at one student's daily school life in this modern era and investigate how globalization has affected him specifically. Do you think studying at an international school has helped you become more of a globalized citizen?
Well, I help people from different nationalities studying in the school. So when I make friends with them, they tell me about how they think the world is. So I guess I have a broader perspective on the world itself.
And how do you think this school compares to your last Indian school you went to?
I think this school is better. My old school, it was just chalk and talk, and like the teacher, we get a textbook, the teacher explains the stuff in it, she writes some notes, we memorize it, and we go for the test. But in this school, it's more of an inquiry-based learning, so you learn by yourself, and by doing it that way, you can remember it easier.
And do you think globalization has led to the idea of having an international Australian school in the Middle East?
Yeah, without globalization, you wouldn't have international schools at all. Just be like national schools, I guess.
Do you think it's important to be a globalized citizen?
Yeah, it helps us learn the economic, political, and social differences between different cultures and countries. We can become more tolerant and more understanding of different people.
Okay. Thank you for your time today, Rahul, and I'll be talking to you later on. And that's all from us this week. Hope you've enjoyed the program. Hey guys, here's some further tips to make sure you do well in your assessment. First point is your video should be at least 4 minutes long. Please ensure that it is. If you'd like to go for 5, 6, 7 or 8 minutes, that'll be fine as well. Also, when you hand your video in, make sure it's not too big. If you're shooting in 1080p or super high def, the file is likely to be around 3, 4, 500 megabytes or more. Make sure that you use a format that has the file at no more than half a gigabyte or 500 megabytes. Preferably, your file will only be around 100 megabytes or less. Please ensure your file is easily read on most devices. If the format that it's been shot in is specific for a type of tablet or a camcorder, that's not okay. The formats that you use should ensure the file can be played back on any or most laptops or most devices. So no obscure files, please. Also, please hand in a copy of the script of everything that is said in the actual news report. This should be typed, size 12, and Arial font. And last but not least, make sure there is a reference list or a bibliography to make use of all the sources that you use in your news report. So if you gather information from the internet about facts from Dubai, or whether it's geographical information, and you use those facts in your report, please list these in your reference list. Okay, let's turn the page now and check out the rubric. Okay guys, we're going to check out the rubric now. Essentially, it's divided into 5 separate parts: knowledge and understanding, investigating, communicating, participating, and reflecting. Let's check out knowledge and understanding to begin with. Essentially what this is how much you know about the topics and how well you can demonstrate your understanding. The topics of this news report are the effects of globalization upon the UAE and the country's ecological footprint. So we want you to understand how globalization plays a role in the UAE, how it's come about, how it has affected the daily life of the Emirati, etc., etc. You also need to understand what an ecological footprint is and understand what the UAE's ecological footprint is as well. And we're also going to get you to look at sustainable practices that can balance human activity and environmental processes. So what this means is perhaps solutions to try and lessen the ecological footprint of Dubai. Next is investigating. This is more or less your use of sources and your use of referencing and your research ability. So if we can see that you've researched your information very thoroughly and you've listed it accurately in a reference list, then this is where you'll get a good mark. Next one is communication. This is the way you speak, the way you present your information, the structure, and your use of vocabulary. So please make sure that you use very strong language, be very articulate with your speaking, and hopefully your communication grade will reflect that. The last 2 areas here are participating and reflecting. And essentially both of these will be assessed through your solutions of the problems. So when you look at the massive ecological footprint of the UAE, what solutions can you come up with to try and solve this situation? And what plans could you put into place to try and reduce the ecological footprint and to resolve the problems of globalization within the UAE? If you look at all 5 parts of this criteria here and you address each one specifically and you try your best in each one, you will maximize your chances of receiving a good grade. Okay, next let's have a look at some more tips to do with this assessment. If you turn to the 3rd page of your task sheet, you'll notice some further tips for your assessment. You may have noticed in my news report I left out some essential information, and this was done deliberately. I did this so students would not copy the information that I presented and use it directly inside their report. I did, however, mention the population, the size, and I briefly touched on the culture of the UAE. You will need to take these points further and investigate them. Some things I did not mention, which you will need to mention, is how has globalization affected the UAE over time? This means how has globalization changed the everyday life of the UAE citizens and residents? You may want to look at a shopping mall, have a look at the food choices there. You may want to look at the daily life and consumerism of the UAE. It's up to you. I had a look at how schooling has been affected. You can also do this if you want. But choose some areas and see how globalization has changed the daily life and the future and outlook of citizens and residents of the UAE. Next one, which I did not touch on at all, which you will need to research, is information about the ecological or the global footprint of the UAE. How big is it? What is a global footprint? And how does it compare to other countries? You will also need to come up with at least 2 recommendations to decrease the global or ecological footprint of the UAE. Don't forget to reference all your sources. Last but not least, you will be required to include some extra information that has not been mentioned up here. These are some suggestions for possible information. So when you have a look at these ideas here, feel free to take one of these and run with it and create an interview based on one of these things here, or an investigation, or come up with your own ideas as well. The first one is, what were the traditional industries of the UAE? What was the traditional lifestyle of an Emirati before globalization and the discovery of oil? This is comparing the lifestyle of Emiratis or residents from before oil discovery and the rapid globalization of the UAE to post-oil discovery. The second one is, how has education in the UAE changed over time? What this refers to is how education has come a long way in the UAE, and a lot of this has to do with globalization as well. This is one area that I briefly touched on in my news report. The third point, how has leadership and control changed over time, and how have government policies changed in order to accommodate globalization? Has the government become more lax in their policies? Have they allowed things to happen in the UAE recently that would never have been accepted decades ago? And how does this relate to globalization and tourism? Are Emiratis happy with the changes in the UAE over the past few decades? You may want to interview your parents, your grandparents, or some relatives who have lived in the UAE for a long time and get their opinion on how globalization has affected their lifestyle and their country. How has consumerism and technology changed the typical lifestyle of a young person in the UAE? Again, you may interview your friends, citizens, residents of the UAE, and see how their lifestyles are compared to what their parents' lifestyles might have been when they were younger. And how has consumerism and technology changed this lifestyle for good? And last one is, how has globalization impacted upon the lives of others who work in the UAE? Essentially, if you would like to go interview somebody who works at Burger King, could be a Nepalese man who works there, who used to be working in the mountains in Mount Everest perhaps, and now he works at Burger King, and you can see how globalization has led him to work in the UAE and how globalization has affected his life. So again, these are just suggestions, and whether you want to do these or not is up to you, but you need to include some extra information to back up your point about how globalization has affected the UAE. If you have any other further questions, or if there's anything else you need to know, feel free to ask your teachers or email them, and I'm sure they'll be more than happy to help. Okay, thanks for listening, and until next time, good luck studying.